Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. This is your host, Dan Turchin, advisor at Insight Finder, the system of intelligence for IT operations, and CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. I got a special announcement before we kick off today's discussion. We just published our 75th episode. It was last week. Thank you to everyone of our listeners for making AI and the Future of Work one of the most downloaded podcasts in our space. Truly, from the bottom of my heart, I thank you. We are 75 episodes in, but I promise we're just getting started. It'd be great if you'd take a minute to review the show in your podcast app if you enjoy what we do. Today's discussion is timely in the wake of recent ransom attacks and data breaches, including high-profile ones, including SolarWinds and more recently Kaseya, that have impacted so much in our lives, from gas prices to meat prices, and really just entire global supply chains. We're all feeling a little bit insecure about who owns our data, how they use it, and probably most important, what happens if that data is breached. A hot topic in security circles right now is social engineering, which is attempts by hackers to trick you out of your credentials. The future of authentication has never been more relevant, more important. For decades, we've been anticipating the end of passwords and traditional MFA or multi-factor authentication techniques, including PINs, one-time passwords, that sort of thing. Well, we got a treat because today's guest developed a better way. Biometric authentication may, emphasis on the may, get us out of this mess. John Whaley founded UnifyID in 2015 to solve the identity management problem after having received his PhD in computer science, then spending time as a lecturer at Stanford. Today, we're going to get a glimpse into the mind of an entrepreneur and a technologist who has navigated that path from academia to then being a technical founder to being a CEO, then being acquired after raising $20 million in a Series A led by NEA, one of the most storied firms in Silicon Valley. Thanks to Vinay from John's team for the intro to John. We got lots to unpack today. Without further ado, John, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the podcast. Let's get started by having you share a little bit about your background and how you ended up in this space.
Sure, yeah, and it's great to be here. Yeah, so my background, I've always been very technical. I've been programming since I was 5 years old, and it never really stopped since then. And so, I went to MIT in my undergrad. I spent some time at IBM Research. I did my PhD at Stanford, all in computer science. And my area of expertise was really in security and some aspects of machine learning there as well. That's what I did my PhD in. I had my first company I actually founded out of Stanford called Mocha 5. That one eventually got acquired after around 10 years and then quickly left there and then started UnifyID. And I think that was around 6 years ago now. And yeah, just very, very recent news. This one just got acquired as well. And yeah, so something that we're super excited about. So anyway, that's my general background. I had a little stint as well where I worked as a lecturer at Stanford for a couple of years, teaching the compilers class.
Congrats on the acquisition, of course, to you and the team. Let's pick up there. So you've now twice gone through the process of getting acquired. What were the signs that it was the right time to be acquired?
Ultimately, so each of these experiences were quite different. The first time around and now this time around, but ultimately what the question comes down to is that, are you better off, working towards this goal as part of this other organization, or are you better off continuing to go your own? And there just the background on UnifyID, we started in 2015. We had very innovative technology. We launched on stage at TechCrunch Disrupt, and in San Francisco. We ended up winning runner up there. We won The next year we won at RSA Innovation Sandbox, the first ever and then still only ever unanimous winner of Innovation Sandbox. We won a bunch of other awards and those kind of things, and very innovative technology, and very strong on the technology side. In some sense, like we're a little bit early. I think it was like, we were doing and talking about these things back in 2016, and there wasn't much of a behavioral biometrics market at that point. Now there is, and there's starting to be more and more one. But I mean, ultimately, it came down to this: is like, well, we could continue to go it alone, build up the sales and go-to-market organization that's required to be successful, in this market. And I know very well, from my past experience, I knew very well exactly what that would mean, and and the time that it would take and the capital it would take. And then, or we could decide to join forces with another organization and, potentially accelerate that. And so that's where, we were at a crossroads there where you had mentioned that we had raised 20 million for our Series A. We were that was back in 2017. That money plus like some amount of revenue, that brought us to 2021. But like as we looked in 2021, we're facing, well, we want to raise a Series B and tell the story around, okay, this is the path, this is where we're going, or do we look to for some type of strategic acquisition at that point, or to join forces with another organization where we would be able to bring a lot to the table, where at the same time they would be able to dramatically accelerate some of the other parts of building the business, which is really where the next stage was. So I mean, that's ultimately what it came down to here. And then it's for any founder when you're looking at this. I mean, like all the best founders, they don't look at like, well, where's the best market opportunity, and let me go and do that, right? The ones who are the best, like they have some deep-seated passion about solving some particular problem, and they or they have some very unique insight, about how to solve that problem, right? And there's a lot, especially during the early days, there's a lot of perseverance that's required that can really only come from having that type of passion. Not just like, hey, I want to be a successful entrepreneur, but like, no, I really desperately want to see this problem get solved. And in some cases, like the best way to solve the problem is to join forces with another organization. And you kind of have to set like ego aside, and you have to kind of set personal, investment aside there. And which is, I mean, it's an adjustment to make, but I mean, ultimately, you have to do what's right for, for yourself, for the company, and like what's going to actually see, your dream, succeed and go into the market.
What was the founding vision for UnifyID, and describe the problem in the market that you set out to solve?
Yeah, UnifyID, authentication is just really fundamentally broken. I mean, like the methods that we used and continue to use, and the predominant methods for authentication are just not. They do not have the human being in mind, right? Things like passwords, like I'm gonna have this secret. I'm gonna somehow remember that, and then I'm going to then tell you that secret, and that's how you know it's gonna be that it's me. Is like, the fact I told you the secret that well, of course, I mean, I'm not very good at coming up with good secrets, and you could, somebody could overhear us, and like you could go and tell somebody else, and I have to tell everyone's different secrets. It just doesn't scale. It doesn't make sense. I mean, it worked fine for some period of time, but now, in the case where you have hundreds of accounts and things like that, it's just not the right model anymore. And truthfully, I mean, you've seen this in other areas of technology as well. I mean, initially, the technology is not very good, and so people have to adapt to the limitations of technology. And eventually, but technology, it progresses very quickly, and so eventually, technology reaches a point where, instead of people having to adapt to the limitations of technology is adapting to the way that people actually are. And so this problem of identity, this is not new. This is not new to technology. I mean, this existed since prehistoric times, or even, any social creature has a need to know, okay, who are you? Are you who are you supposed to be? Can I trust you? Like these fundamental questions. And how did we do that in the past? Well, you look at somebody's face, you listen to their voice, you see the context under which you see them, you see what possessions, like these type of things. And we all have very refined neural networks that are very good at doing this, and that have evolved over many millennia, that are very, very good at doing this. And that it's just a much more natural way of authenticating. Like, you should be able to be yourself, and then there's enough that's unique about you that, like, we should be able to authenticate you. And the truth is, like, that, like, what was a vision in the past is now actually a practical reality because of all the sensors in people's lives. Like, primarily on the smartphone, I mean, everyone carries around smartphones. There's around 10 very high precision sensors in all of these things, not to mention things like wearables and IoT and these other areas. So really, I mean, the goal of UnifyID is to make authentication better for users, better both in terms of security as well as user experience. These have traditionally been viewed as like opposites, so like in conflict. Well, it's like, well, if I want to have a better user experience, that means I'm making security worse. It's like, well, if I want it to be high security, that means like it comes at the expense of friction in the user experience. And it doesn't have to be the case anymore. There's enough technology, like innovative technology, that exists where you could just be yourself, and then there's enough that's unique about you that we can actually authenticate you, based on your unique behavior. And that's really, I mean, that, like, and this transcends beyond online to also physical world interactions, and times when you're calling on the phone, and you walk into a brick and mortar store, or you into your house, you approach your car, going travel, all of these things. Like, there's a need for authentication. And we strongly believe that the future of authentication is going to be passive. It's going to be seamless. It's going to be just happening in the background all the time. It's going to be much less explicit and more implicit.
These insights make so much sense, and yet the identity management space has been broken for so long. Is it just a technological impediment, and UnifyID came up with a better technology solution, or is there some other reason why the pace of innovation has been glacial in this space?
I mean, the truth is, identity and authentication are very tied up with humans and human behavior, and which is actually the hard part. That's the hard part to change. It's like, even if you do, like, the technology is absolutely a piece of it. And then it's the kind of thing where when you have the right technology, then suddenly, like, things become a lot more natural. Like, we have definitely seen that to be the case. But I mean, number one, authentication and identity is very sticky. I mean, it's very hard to change because it has connections everywhere, and you can't just go through and rip and replace. You have to be able to supplement in various places where you use your existing identity stack, but you kind of add some new capabilities on top of that, which kind of makes the problem very hard. The second thing is, honestly, it's kind of unsexy and overlooked, right? I mean, if you are a product manager designing your next great product, I mean, like, people don't typically think about, oh, what's my authentication experience going to be? Now, I mean, I would argue you should, because I think it's very important, because that's often the first experience someone has with your product or your brand. But that's not the way that people typically think of those things. They're typically thinking about it in terms of, okay, well, yeah, okay, you'll authenticate somehow. We'll do a password, or maybe you'll send an email, something. But then once you're in there, then, like, well, that's the experience that they care about. And so it has been overlooked. It's pretty unsexy. There's a lot of legacy there, and you have to interact with legacy systems. You can't, like, rip and replace. All of those things contribute. Another big contributor is the fact that, just in general, anything around security is naturally conservative. Like, people, I mean, for rightly so. I mean, people don't necessarily trust new technology or new techniques, because they typically move a little bit. So things in security typically move a little bit slower than in other industries. I mean, potentially for good reason. I think there is value in being somewhat conservative on the security side. But like these things have certainly held it back. And by the way, like these ideas are not really new. I mean, I remember back in, what was it, like early 2000s or so. I mean, I remember Netscape was talking about this. They were talking about, hey, we're gonna have a huge PKI, and like there's going to be certificates for every person and every device, and like nobody has to use passwords and all these things. Like, I mean, they were not able to accomplish it. In fact, like no one has really been able to accomplish it so far. Now, I think that is changing. We're on the cusp now of a lot of these things changing, and we're starting to see that, like with things like passwords starting to go away, and like increasing use of mobile devices and authentication and other areas. But yeah, it's like certainly like these are not really new ideas, but I think there's a few things that have happened recently that have really catalyzed the movement towards a better form of authentication and identity.
In recent weeks, we've been having a series of conversations about the ethics of AI. And one of the questions that has been really interesting to get a variety of answers to is what could go wrong? And I think that's very germane to this conversation. So talk us through how you mitigate the impact of both false positives and false negatives when I'm authenticating using biometric data.
Yeah, and this is an area. I mean, ourselves. We think about this a lot, and this, I mean, broadly as the increasing use of like machine learning and like in AI systems. This is a very important topic. I mean, ultimately, when you have to be very careful about bias in these types of systems, right? And if you build a system that is biased against some type of group of users or some type of a particular gender or a particular race or any anything like that, like you just have to be very careful about it. And some of it is, in some cases, it's just like AI can just serve to reinforce existing human biases or amplify them, right? In some cases it may be more pure, but like the emergent property of the system is that it is biased against a certain group, right? And it's not just like, you really have to look at this in terms of an end-to-end approach. It's not just a data problem. I mean, in some cases people will say, hey, like we just don't have good data sets, and that's why our systems are biased. They're like, well, that's not, the data sets are a part of it. That is not the complete answer, though, because the algorithms that were used, that were developed with an eye towards an existence of other data sets, and so that there's going to be bias that's built into those like the very techniques that we work on, or even the very problems that we work on. Like there's there are a number of biases that creep in there as well. And the goal is to not completely eliminate bias. It's just to be cognizant of it and to make sure that it's going to be fair and equitable for everyone. So, I mean, in the context of UnifyID, like we really set out to make sure that, when we're training our systems, we do it on a very diverse data set, not necessarily a large data set, but one that kind of really captures all the many different types of people and many different of different age ranges and genders who live in different countries and behave in different ways and all these things. Because like the way that our system works, like the implications are not very significant. It's more like, hey, if our system can't match against you, well, you're going to have a little bit worse time. You're going to have to go and fall back and use some, like your authentication experience is going to be a little bit worse. But I mean, ultimately, you're still be able to get in, and you're still be able to, make the purchase or do whatever else you need to do. But there, but it is something that we do spend a considerable amount of time on, to make sure that we don't have blind spots, and we're not, and we operate well, like with a variety of people in a variety of situations.
We've been conditioned to fear that anyone with access to our fingerprint, a scan of our iris, the structure of our cheekbones could potentially fabricate that and misuse our biometric data. Is that fear mongering? Is it real? And if it's real, what are you're an expert in the field. What are some of the ways that you've found you can mitigate against that risk?
It is. I mean, it's funny. You hear, Apple, for example, like they used to say, your face is your password. And it's like, your face is not your password. Your face is your username. Your face is, there's nothing private about your face. You literally, this is like what you project to the world and say, this is who I am. And so like, this is not, although it's very convenient, it's certainly not private. Other things like fingerprints, for example, are increasingly not private. And that's really the challenge around biometrics, is there are most of the time they're immutable. So they are very, very, very hard to change. Like if your fingerprints get compromised, which, by the way, I mean, I think it's inevitable that like just about every person, in the United States, if not the world, like their fingerprints either have been compromised or will be compromised at some point. I mean, like you literally like leave them everywhere you go. And like, I mean, I go to the gym, and I haven't been to the gym for a while because of the pandemic, but like when I went to the gym, there was, like how do you authenticate to the gym? Well, there's a fingerprint reader there, right? And you scan your fingerprint, and the fitness club they go to, and they have they have locations all over the place. Do I honestly believe that they know enough about IT security to keep all of those fingerprints, secure? How surprised would I be to see this? Like there's a data breach involving that. Not very surprised at all. I mean, in fact, this has happened, and this happened in the UK. There's, and in government databases, these kind of things. So like, it's kind of inevitable that these will be released and will be compromised. And like, the problem is that they are, once they're compromised, then they're no longer reliable factors to use for authentication, because like anybody can get them and spoof them, right? And on the other side, things like face and fingerprint and others, there are a lot of technologies, voice as well. That's another big one, where through technologies like deep fake type of technologies, you can create very, very convincing spoofs of these, where it's like of somebody's voice or these type of things. And these are things like literally I can go on a website today, I can go and I can type in a message, and I can then have a machine learning system that is actually very good. It's good enough to fool somebody over the phone, right? And just, you can imagine kind of getting enough samples of somebody's voice to be able to build one of these systems, and then have it spoof their voice enough to pretend to be the CEO who calls to say, hey, can you make this money transfer? Like, of course, like these attacks are happening all the time. And so, I mean, the real answer to this is that you have to have a defense in depth, and you can't just rely on any single factor. There is no silver bullet in security or authentication. Like it just doesn't exist. Like you need to combine multiple factors together just to make it hard enough that to make it hard enough or expensive enough that they'll go after another tactic to try to get access to you, or they'll give up and they'll go after someone else, right? That's really what it comes down to. And if you think about what are the factors are going to be that are the most expensive, well, it's the ones that actually where the user has to do something extra, right? Maybe if every time they have to type in a password, or they have to send you a PIN that you type in, or you have to do a facial scan or a iris scan or your palm or these kind of things. If you have to do that regularly, that ends up being very expensive from a user experience point of view. Now, there's a number of factors you can use, the information you can get just passively. I mean, just like the way that somebody types, for example, the way they hold their phone, the way they walk around, like their location, the places they go, the Wi-Fi access points that are around them, and the fact they have a Bluetooth wearable device, and all of this. Like, I mean, these things you can all pick up passively, And although there's no silver bullet or in security or authentication, and none of these are perfect, but you combine the confluence of all these factors together, and then you can get a pretty accurate picture. Because then it's like, okay, well, let's say I wanted to attack this system. It's like, well, I need to now compromise the person's phone. I would need to know what Wi-Fi access points are near there, or I need to then go and maybe if I'm using a computer, I'd have to compromise both the computer and the phone, and maybe a wearable device. And so it gets more complex to be able to do this type of attack. Obviously, there's no such thing as absolute security either. So like every system is hackable, but it just becomes it becomes more difficult to hack. And so that's really what the approach here is you can't just rely on one single factor, because like there always will be attacks. You have to combine multiple factors together to try to make it more difficult to hack.
So not that UnifyID would do this, but let's say hypothetically, big tech conglomerate starts authenticating me using my biometric data, and they're breached. What does it mean that some third party now owns and could potentially sell or monetize my biometric data? What does that mean what are the implications for humanity when something so hyper personal, it's in question who actually owns that data?
I mean, and this is fundamentally like why we even started UnifyID in the first place. Is like we saw a lot of organizations doing these types of things, right? Basically, they're collecting information about users and they're using it for reasons that are not necessarily aligned with the user's best interests, or they don't really understand the privacy implications of it, and they don't really understand the right way to protect the data. So the terrible way to do this is to build a database of everyone's biometric information and store that somewhere. And then it's not a question of if it gets hacked, it's a question of when. And and then there's a lot of very private data in there. It goes beyond, it's just like, hey, what's my fingerprint and those kind of things. But like if you look at somebody's behavior, you can tell an amazing amount about somebody. You can tell if they have health issues. You can tell if they're depressed or not. You can tell that like their gender. You can tell where they grew up. Like there's an amazing amount of information that you can tell just by just passive behavioral signals of these type of things, and stuff which you may not, which is, I mean, ultimately private to you. I mean, the model here has to be that you as an individual must own your own data. I mean, you must. I mean, and you may in some cases decide to allow access to that, or rent it out, or but that's temporary. You should always be able to go back and say, you know what, I don't want you to use my data anymore. And so you have to not only you have to erase all of it and stop using it. Now this is not like, there's the startings of this with things like GDPR, CCPA, and BIPA, and like there's a bunch of other regulations that are going through where they have the startings of this type of philosophy. But I mean, ultimately, this is the direction that these things have to go. Like you have to have sovereignty over your own behavioral information, your own biometric information. And this is why, so when we architected the system, the biometric data stays on the local device. Like I don't want to be personally in a situation where, I can be coerced into giving up somebody's biometric data. I mean, I always need to be in the situation where it's like, well, I mean, unless you have the person's physical device, I literally cannot help you because it's architected in the way that we don't have direct access to any of this, right? And that's really the only tenable solution, because otherwise, I mean, it'll just put us in a bad situation. I mean, maybe we get subpoenaed, right? Maybe we get hacked. Maybe, somebody kidnaps my kids and threatens it, whatever, right? It's just not in order to get to give up this data, really the only solution that you can have is that, okay, this has to live on the device, and then we have no way to directly access any of that data, which is, I mean, obviously makes it a much more challenging technical problem. I mean, it's much easier to just say, hey, we're going to have a massive database of everyone and then match them, and it pushes us to many more technologies around doing more things on client devices and like how to architect the system the right way. But I mean, this is ultimately our goal in founding UnifyID, was that we just wanted to be the best in the world at this. And although not everybody at this point may care about these type of privacy aspects, we do, and we know how to architect it in the way that will reflect that. So rather than going and build and roll your own, rather than the 200 companies that I work with are all independently collecting behavioral information and building behavioral profiles and like collecting my biometrics and storing them all in databases, which will be breached. The goal here was really to, it's like, hey, we're really good at that, and we understand the way to do the privacy. So because we're architected in this way, you can still get all the benefit, but like while users can still maintain their privacy. So I think that's the way that things have to go. There will be more data breaches. There will be more high profile data breaches. Some are going to be very sensitive information, and I think, and then there's going to be a backlash in terms of from like the legislative and like judicial side, in terms of what companies are allowed to do. And I mean, ultimately now companies are changing their tune on this. It used to be, they used to say like data is the new oil, and like, okay, the goal is to collect as much data as you possibly can because data is such an important asset. Now it's increasingly around, especially around personal data and biometric data. Now they say data is the new kryptonite because there's certain type of data that you just, as an organization, you do not want to hold on to because it is a liability for your organization. Because if and when it gets breached, it's going to be, there are serious consequences of that. And a lot of that type of personal biometric data is of that ilk. So, I think that many, CIOs and CISOs and executives at this level, they're starting to realize the importance of that. They're starting to kind of actually going through is like, do we actually need to retain this data? Okay, no, we don't. Okay, let's get rid of it because this is actually a liability for the company. I'm glad to see that things are like that people are starting to view data in this way.
This show is about AI and the future of work, and it seems crazy that the present of work is so onerous in terms of authentication. Like, as much as everything we're talking about here makes sense, that like the fact is, like, the predominant way that we authenticate ourselves to apps is through passwords and pins. How long before, like, in a work setting, I'm not going to have to rely on this awful experience that's insecure?
Yeah. So unfortunately, I mean, and this is somewhat legacy, that the employees and contractors and workers really get the short end of the stick because they like the culture is, it's like, well, you have a job here, here are the rules that you have to follow, and this is what you have to do. Right now, I think that the place where we see most of the innovation happening is actually more on the end user side. I mean, like, these are brands that, they care about user experience. They want to have more streamlined, like onboarding and authentication experiences. And so you see like, major brands, especially ones that are kind of have a strong mobile presence, they're starting to go passwordless. Instead of, it's like the first baby steps of this. It's like, well, instead of like I set up a password as like I'll send you a text message and maybe you type in a code or you click on a link in there, or I'll send you an email, those kind of things to authenticate. Okay, I'll remember your session. I'll be smart about that. Like there's like technologies like WebAuthn, which are kind of they're not fully there yet, but they're starting to get there. And like you see more and more embracing of that. Like on the worker side, okay, the mentality is very much okay. Well, like workers are somehow less important around this. Now, I think this is going to change. Much in the same way you saw kind of in the whole consumerization of IT trends that happened kind of in, around 10 to 15 years ago. There's things like Wi-Fi, for example. It's like people are using Wi-Fi at home, and it's like we should use Wi-Fi in the business. And so they brought that stuff in, right? iPhones, same thing. I mean, it was like there's a whole list of those things that were kind of like the innovations were first on the consumer side, and then they were eventually dragged in to the organizations, often in very grassroots ways. It's hard to do grassroots stuff like when you're talking about identity and authentication, but I mean, these things will still continue to happen, and ultimately, it becomes a recruiting tool, or becomes a employee retention, employee happiness tool, right? It's like, well, do I want to go to this, work at this company with this antiquated IT system where it's like they make me rotate my password every month, and like every time I have to add a new symbol and whatever, and then like annoying 2FA and like, all this stuff. Like there's, it's, like, or do I want to work for this other organization where it's like, where you have a much better experience? And so, like, especially among certain professions, like you start to see some of these things first, places where, they may have security or compliance type of things, but they also have people who are very impatient and they want to get their work done. I think you'll start to see this, especially in tech companies. I mean, like, it's just, for somebody in technology to look at these things like passwords and everything, and the way that authentication works, it's just very frustrating for them. And so I think all you really need is, like, you need to have some visionary, person within the organization that says, you know what, I care about employee experience. Let's move forward with one of these type of new type of approaches, which, by the way, we've seen work at banks and we've seen work in a number of these other contexts. So it's not really a question of, can it be secure enough? It's really, a question of will on that side. So like this is why most of our traction has been on this B2B2C type of markets, where it's like, hey, we help a bank, authenticate their end user, or like a ride sharing app, or those those type of things, like where it's you have security concerns, you have risk, trying to manage risk, you're trying to detect fraud and prevent fraud, these type of things, but you also care a lot about user experience, right? And so I think that, like, currently there's not a lot of consideration to employee experience. I think that will change, especially as the nature of work changes and you get more like different forms of work. I mean, like the whole traditional thing of like, I go to the office, I work there 9 to 5, like everything that's happened through this pandemic, all those things are changing. And so I think this is, this is another thing where it'll, like, we'll start to see changes in this area as well.
John, I hope that when we have you back, we're going to be celebrating the demise of the password.
Yeah, it was. I mean, the people have been predicting that for a long time. I mean, hey, look, passwords are never going to completely go away. They will always have their place. They'll just become, I'll make a prediction, right here on your broadcast, on your podcast right now, that within 2 years from now. So I mean, we're talking about, in 2023, like, so number one, the password alone is no longer going to be the predominant method of authentication. It will still exist, and it'll still exist in some cases, but it will no longer be the number one factor. It will be, it'll be used in backup situations. It'll be used and supplemented with other types of authentication, but it will no longer be the predominant one. And like that, like there's all the indications are pointing in that direction.
You heard it here first. 2023. I'm going to circle it on my calendar. Hey, John, we're about out of time, but I can't let you off the hot seat without this one last question. Just I want to understand a little bit more about your personal journey. So you went from being an academic, you were a founding CTO, you're CEO of a venture-backed company. What has each experience taught you about yourself?
I mean, it's kind of cheesy. I mean, I think ultimately it's just, don't pretend to be somebody that you're not, and like, don't pretend to be somebody that, like, you think that, oh, this is what this role requires, therefore that's the way I should be. I'm a very technical person. I mean, I've been programming since I was 5 years old. I love engineering, technology. When I went to start the company, I mean, my first time around was a CTO. That was great. Second time around, it was like, okay, well, I'm going to be the CEO this time. I mean, and partially because I had worked for kind of enough CEOs, like seen it enough. As like, okay, like I feel like I could do a reasonable job at this. I got some advice, for example, like when we are first starting UnifyID, where it says, okay, you should remove your, like the PhD from your business card, because people see that it's like, oh, they're going to dismiss you and say, oh, you're so impractical, you're so, they're like, you're ivory tower academic, you don't understand how the real world works, you don't know how to sell things, any of that, right? And then I thought about it, and it was like, no, I mean, I spent whatever 5+ years doing this. I mean, I'm not going to take it off my resume. I'm going to put on there proudly, right? And because it's kind of like, there was a time in my life that I had spent where I was kind of trying to live for other people, or trying to be kind of pretend to be somebody that was like just not fundamentally not my nature. And it was not, and then a number of things happened in my life that was like, okay, this is not the way to do things. I'm like, I'd much rather just be myself, and then be much more authentic, and like play to my strengths, I guess. And so this is the part where it's like, well, you know what? Yeah, I am a PhD, and I am like a college professor. And what that means is like, I can go to like a machine learning conference, and I can give a talk, right? And I can give a very technical talk. And most startup CEOs can't do that, but I can, which means that I can go there and I can, number one, we get a huge amount of technical credibility. Number two, it makes it like way easier to recruit technical talent, and like identify and recruit the right technical talent, all this, right? And then, and so like you get all these benefits, and then people like will naturally flock to you and gravitate to you if you're kind of like living that kind of more authentic life, and not trying to pretend that you're somebody that you're not. So, I mean, understand very much your strengths and weaknesses, understand what you're good at and what you're not, really play to your strengths. And then in the areas where you that you're not strong, basically find partners or other people who can supplement you in those areas. I mean, this is when you're starting a company, especially, it's like, they like, you have some real challenges if like everybody is technical and nobody's really sure, or everybody's in the same type of role, and like the roles are not really that super crisply defined, and like, and then you step on each other's toes, and it's like, who's responsible for what? And then there's whole areas where like they don't get get addressed at all. Like, this is where it's like, if you really know yourself and understand yourself and fully embrace that, I mean, like, look, and you can forge your own path. I mean, there's no exact formula for how to start a company or how to be a CEO. Like, you have to be, I mean, you're fundamentally building something new, and so which often like takes a fundamentally new approach. And so don't shy away from it. This is actually your strength. If you're just trying to do the same thing everybody else is doing, you're not going to succeed. Like, you should, so just play to your strength, and then and then things will work out, and then understand where your limitations are, and then supplement those with the right people. That's my recommendation, based on my experiences in my last 2 companies.
Well, John, we went way off script, and we went way over time. And I'm glad we did on both accounts. This is a fascinating discussion, and I hope you'll come back for another version. Well, there you have it, our 76th episode in the book. Thanks again to John for a great discussion, and of course to Vinay from UnifyID for the introduction to John. This is your host, Dan Turchin, signing off for this week, but back next week with another fascinating guest.